Hello, this lecture aims to introduce you to the textual criticism of the New Testament. This is a broad overview. Additional lectures will go into more detail on a number of these points. First, we have to begin with the question, what is textual criticism? It's not exactly a familiar phrase that we would use. Textual criticism refers to the study of the original text. The goal of textual criticism is to reconstruct or to discern the original text. You may wonder, why do we need to discern or reconstruct the original text, especially if you've had a theology course which has told you that the text is inspired, the original text is inerrant, and all of those things are absolutely true. But why is it that we need textual criticism? The need for textual criticism has a number of points, actually. None of the original manuscripts or autographs of the New Testament have survived. The word manuscript simply means a handwritten copy, so we're talking about those copies of Scripture that were produced prior to the printing press. Autographs refer to those copies that were actually written by the biblical authors themselves. And we have none of those original manuscripts. Now, what we do have are numerous New Testament manuscripts spanning all the way back to the 3rd century and running into the time prior to the printing press. But we don't have the originals. And among the manuscripts that we do have, numerous differences exist. So there are numerous differences in our existing or extant copies. And generally, those differences aren't anything to be worried about. Generally, they are spelling errors, like the difference in the American spelling of center and the British spelling of center or honor or labor, any of those words that we think of. This often happens in Greek manuscripts when a word has similar sounds or some sort of spelling difference dependent on regions. There are also differences in word order, and in Greek, this doesn't usually make that great of a difference. But sometimes these errors or these differences are significant. I was leading a Bible study not too long ago on Mark chapter 1, and we came to verse 41, which most of us around the table had the ESV, and Mark 1:41 reads, "Moved with pity," referring to Jesus, "he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, 'I will be clean.'" This was what I was familiar with and what I had preached from on Sunday, but I asked someone in our group to read from their personal copy, and they read from the NIV, which says, "Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. 'I am willing,' he said, 'be clean.'" Now, how do these things happen? What about the difference? As you can imagine, in the small group study, I hardly wanted to talk about a textual variant, but I wasn't able to get out of the situation that I had accidentally put my group into by introducing this issue of textual criticism. So when we talk about textual criticism, we're talking about how do these things happen? This issue in Mark 1:41. Why are the ESV and the NIV so radically different? So how does this happen? Well, the production of copies creates a situation where there are differences in wording. Bruce Metzger, who is one of the most prominent textual critics, who's recently passed away, writes, "It was inevitable that such handwritten copies would contain a greater or less number of differences in wording from the original." So you can imagine, as people are copying Scripture either by looking at another copy or they're listening to someone read as they copy, that these mistakes would happen. Most of the time, we're only talking about accidental mistakes, things like my eye jumped over a word, or I know a different spelling of a word, or I misheard a word, or I misread a word, something like that. So you can think about when you're writing how easy it is to skip words that look similar or have similar endings. If you finish a word that ends in, say, the letter D, your eye may jump down a few lines to another word that ends in the letter D, and you may end up leaving out several lines. Those things happen in the New Testament manuscripts. Sometimes marginal notes also made their way into the text. So you can imagine something like study notes being written in the margin of a manuscript, and then a later scribe incorporating those notes into the text. And there are examples that seem to represent that in the New Testament. But there are also deliberate alterations. Sometimes these aren't nearly as nefarious as it sounds. Sometimes it's simply a scribe who sees an awkward sentence or an obscure sentence, and they just want to make it smoother or clearer. So they may be smoothing out grammar or stylistic harshness. It might mean making a meaning clear or substituting words that they consider more common, that are more well known. This happens in the Gospels when a scribe might be familiar with, say, Matthew's account of a story, and he comes across Mark, who uses different words. There's sometimes a process of harmonization where the scribe, knowing Matthew, will harmonize Mark's account by changing to Matthew's language. There are also translation issues. We're talking about the Greek New Testament. The majority of the class will be spent talking about the Greek New Testament. But by the 2nd century, as Christianity is expanding, the need for Syriac, Latin, and Coptic versions of the New Testament became a reality. Later, by the 4th century, Armenian, Georgian, Ethiopic, Arabic, Nubian, Gothic, Old Church Slavonic, and Anglo-Saxon were added to that mix. Now, with translations, it depends on two factors. One is how well does the scribe know the original Greek? And two, how well does the scribe know the target language that they're translating into? In some cases, scribes don't know either language. They're simply paid to copy and trace the letters. Finally, there's this issue of local text. A local text is a phenomena that is really fascinating in New Testament manuscripts. As Christianity expanded, certain copies became familiar in large cities. And because those were familiar, additional copies were made from them. They were made for distribution. And this caused many manuscripts to preserve unique readings of these local texts. And we can identify where a manuscript comes from sometimes based on these unique readings. Again, Bruce Metzger comments, today it is possible to identify the type of text preserved in New Testament manuscripts by comparing their characteristic readings with the quotations of those passages in the writing of church fathers who lived in or near the chief ecclesiastical centers. Now, of course, these texts eventually were mixed as they traveled and interacted with other types of text, and that adds an additional layer to the difficulty of textual criticism. So we can see the need for textual criticism. We have 4 reasons here. Now, the question we have to ask is, how do we practice textual criticism? What do we do? Well, today I want to introduce you to 2 forms of evidence: external evidence and internal evidence. Additional lectures will detail each of these in greater depth, but for now, let me introduce you to the broad categories. External evidence is concerned with the reliability of the manuscript witnesses. So how reliable is the manuscript, generally speaking? Dr. Black writes, external evidence seeks to determine which reading is supported by the most reliable witnesses. So this takes into account Greek manuscripts and their reputation, the versions like Latin or Syriac, Coptic, whatever it may be, and the citations of the church fathers who themselves are quoting scripture and giving evidence of certain readings. Let me just give some generalized principles here. It is generally thought that a manuscript dating, say, to the 400s is more reliable than one from 1300. Furthermore, Greek manuscripts tend to be valued more highly than other versions, like a Latin version, though date should be considered there, as many Latin, Syriac, and Coptic versions are older than Greek manuscripts. Finally, certain manuscripts have tendencies that make them more suspect. So some manuscripts are notorious for harmonizing gospel accounts. Some are notorious for smoothing over grammatical issues. So we have to be aware of the reputation in general. Now, a word of caution. Manuscripts cannot simply be counted. So it's not enough to say the external evidence favors this reading because 1,000 manuscripts support it. No, those 1,000 manuscripts may actually be stemming from the same family in some cases, reducing them effectively to much, much less. So manuscripts, rather than being counted, should be weighed. You'll hear more about that in the future. But let me share with you 3 principles from Dr. Black on external evidence. Prefer the reading attested by the older manuscripts. Again, a manuscript from 300 or 400 is likely preserving something closer to the original text than something from 1200. But again, not always. It's just a preference that the older tend to be more reliable. Prefer the reading supported in widely separated geographical areas. This means if you have a manuscript that comes from Alexandria and another that comes from the Byzantine Empire, and they agree on a reading, then that wide geographical support, not to mention the fact that those 2 manuscript families likely have varying dates, then you would want to prefer that. Because you have wide geographical support. It's not a local text reading. Third, prefer the reading supported by the greatest number of text types. We'll talk more about text types down the road, but text types are local text. So a text from Alexandria and all of that family surrounding it, Caesarea, Byzantium, all of these different text types, the Western text that we recognize in textual criticism. If a reading is supported by multiple text types, then it is considered more probable. This leads us to the internal evidence. Internal evidence concerns things like scribal habits and practices. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as transcriptional probability, meaning what would the scribes copying a manuscript been likely to do? Would they have been likely to make an alteration in the case that you're looking at? Would they have been likely to insert an additional comment to make the text clear? Those are scribal habits and practices. But internal evidence also concerns the author's style and vocabulary. If you're looking at a variant in Matthew, then you want to take into account the way Matthew uses language in the whole book. Sometimes you'll see this one referred to as intrinsic probability, the intrinsic nature of the book. Dr. Black writes, the reading that best explains the origin of the other readings is probably original. This is a time-tested principle of textual criticism, a very general principle, but the one that explains where the other readings comes from is likely the original reading. 5 principles here. First, prefer the shorter reading. It's more likely that a scribe would add an additional comment than delete things from the text. Again, not always. There would be cases where things that seem embarrassing or difficult are deleted. So you have to use your judgment in those cases. But generally, prefer the shorter reading. Second, prefer the more difficult reading. It is most likely that a scribe would make something smoother, not make it more difficult. Again, if it's an accident, it may actually be far more difficult, if not impossible, in which case the difficult reading should be thrown out. There are always exceptions to these rules. Third, prefer the reading that accords best with the author's style and vocabulary. Here we're talking about intrinsic probability. So consider how Matthew or Mark or whoever it is that you're looking at is using language and how they generally use language. And consider what the variance how the variance might be weighed against that language. Fourth, prefer the reading that best fits the context and or the author's theology, again, related to the way the biblical author is using language. And then 5, prefer the less harmonious reading in parallel passages. This generally applies to Gospels. It may apply in a few cases to something like Ephesians and Colossians that are very similar. But in the Gospels, as I mentioned earlier, a scribe knowing Matthew may have a tendency to harmonize Mark's account and vice versa. And this happens often. So it's often preferred to say, well, if Mark is different from Matthew and there's a variant surrounding that that harmonizes them, the differences are more likely to be original. Now, in textual criticism, we're always dealing with probabilities. So as we talk about external and internal evidence, there is not hard and fast rules. We're only talking about what is most probable. In fact, Bruce Metzger has a famous comment. He says, although the external evidence for two sets of variant readings may be exactly the same, and that often happens, considerations of transcriptional and or intrinsic probabilities of readings may lead to quite diverse judgments concerning the original text. It's very subjective at times when we consider the transcriptional and intrinsic probabilities of a variant. He goes on. This is, of course, only another way of saying that textual criticism is an art as well as a science, and demands that each set of variants be evaluated in the light of the fullest consideration of both external evidence and internal probabilities. Textual criticism is both an art and a science. And that should actually be encouraging as you begin your journey in this field. That many of the decisions you make on a text are subjective, but it is often a matter of applying the principles and reconstructing the text, not just scientifically, but artistically. So let that be an encouragement as you begin this journey. I think it will be well worth your time.